Warning. This episode contains frank discussions of race and racism that some may find challenging to listen to. Listener discretion is advised. But it also contains stories of overcoming challenges that some may find to be inspiring. Enjoy.
In this episode, I interviewed Dr. Roberta K. She is assistant professor at the Dalalana School of Public Health at the University of Toronto. Her work is grounded in anti-oppression and community-based health promotion. We actually recorded this last year, and even though it was our first ever episode, so it was my first time interviewing someone, our pilot episode, we're releasing this now because we feel like people really need it. We cover a lot in here. We talk about oppression and we talk about anti-Black racism and colonialism, but also we talk about joy and we talk about coming together and we talk about providing peer support within racialized communities. And so that is why we wanted to share this with you, because although these are very difficult topics, we also laughed and we talk about hope and joy. And I hope that through listening to this, it also brings you hope and joy.
The Race, Health, and Happiness podcast is hosted by Dr. Onye, certified public health physician specialist and family doctor. The views expressed by Dr. O's guests are their own and do not necessarily represent her opinions or those of the podcast. Check out the show notes for more details. And now, here's Dr. O.
Dr. Timothy, thank you so much for joining us for Race, Health, and Happiness.
Thank you, Dr. O, for having me. It's my pleasure.
Why don't we just start with grounding, giving some background. So maybe instead of me giving a long introduction for you, I'll let you just briefly tell us about yourself and how you self-define.
Excellent. Thank you. So in terms of location, I consider myself an African woman via the Caribbean or via the transatlantic slave trade. I am a woman who's working class, from a working class background, woman who's living with a disability. I was legally blind for over 20 years. I've had 2 corneal transplants. And it's an interesting part of my identity that's sometimes often overlooked in regards to my disability, because I don't match what people think about when they think about disability, particularly Blackness and disability. I'm also a mother of 2. My mother came here from the Caribbean as a domestic worker in the early 60s, and I also am the youngest of many children, which is a whole nother story. And I locate myself as a person who's doing active anti-colonial, anti-racist, resistance-centered work.
I really am delighted to talk to you because I get so many questions from students, sometimes patients, about how to be well in a racialized world. And when I learned about your work and how you've just come here to Dalalana, I was like, yes, I definitely need to speak to you now that you are here with us at the University of Toronto. Just to kind of give a case, like a kind of example of what I experienced. So in my work, a lot of it has to do with speaking to different audiences about the impacts that racism has on our day-to-day lives. So really thinking about systems or systemic racism. And so I was giving a talk at another university, and I showed a graph done by Geronimus and colleagues. They published it in the American Journal of Public Health, but it was a study looking at allostatic loads. So, those markers of chronic stress, right? Those physiologic indicators of chronic stress. And so they had measured this for 4 different groups: African American women, African American men, white women, and white men. And what you saw was that the results were much higher for African American women. And so they called this like the double jeopardy of both being Black and experiencing systemic racism, and being a woman and experiencing, systemic sexism. And, the talk went quite well. And at the end of it, 2 young women came to me, students, both racialized. I think one was Black, one was South Asian. And they said, thank you for coming to our school. Thank you for giving voice to this. But we saw that graph where racialized women are experiencing higher stress. And this resonated with us. What do we do to stay well? And so in that moment, I was kind of stuttering. I had to think about the different studies I had looked at, like, if you're the type of person who addresses racism, there's, evidence that lowers your stress compared to being avoidant, peer support groups, some studies on forgiveness. But in that moment, I realized that the studies were not enough. That, after even speaking to other friends and colleagues, there's wisdom in communities who have been surviving and thriving despite systemic racism. So I thought to myself, what are different ways that I can tap into that wisdom and speak to people who are walking that talk? And so I was just so happy to hear that you were here at the University of Toronto and that we met, because you, to me, are someone who's very much walking the talk with regards to like race, health, and happiness. So that's it. And so where you talk about your anti-colonial work and how you do that, I love it. So let's go to the beginnings a little bit, right? And in that spirit of grounding ourselves. So for your upbringing, like from what I understand, you have been doing anti-colonial work like as an embryo or something like that. Like where did it
seems
start?
that way. It seems that way. Yes, I have been actively involved in the women abuse community, feminist communities, and Pan-African communities. I was involved in women abuse or domestic violence abuse. My mother was a counselor, and I, worked with her, and I went to marches, and I was involved in activism. We were also involved in the anti-apartheid movement in the Canadian context, and really, I think I talked earlier about boycotting everything in the world. In terms of my African identity as an African person who has a transatlantic slave history or enslavement history, my mom, who was, who raised all of her children, all of us, always talked about the importance of being African and being proud of who you are, and knowing, even though we had, language, name, land, resources that were taken from us, to accept and to embrace all that is African. So I grew up in a very working class neighborhood. I grew up in Galloway, any Galloway people out there. And we were the first Black families in the townhouse complex. It's a housing complex. And we experienced a lot of anti-Black racism very early on, in terms of being chased by dogs, excrement being burned on our yard, and kind of, so breaking the kind of stereotype and notion that of the myth of Canada, that Canada doesn't, anti-Black racism or racism doesn't exist in Canada. I had direct experiences of it, and I also had direct experiences of resistance against it as a young person. So, in grade 5, people were doing projects on the Red Fox, and I was doing it on, Nelson Mandela and, anti-apartheid, the anti-apartheid movement, et cetera. So I've always been actively involved in resistance movements and actively involved in the arts community. I was involved in theater, spoken word, and any ways of using different tools to resist against racism and other forms of violence. So in some ways I've been breastfed with resistance, and also the importance of African identity and pride. And what that means for me is that it means that I can survive and I can thrive because I know who I am. And no matter there's adversities, there's violence, there's trauma. I work in trauma. There's always different ways of healing, and there's always ways of surviving. If we don't have that hope, what do we have? I went to Ghana. And I went to the Cape Coast, and I've been to Kenya, and I've been to Fort Jesus, where Africans were enslaved. And for me, it was interesting this time when I went to Ghana, when I went to Cape Coast and Elmina. And what I got from that, yes, it was pain, it was intense, but what I also took away was the warriorness of African peoples, as somebody who was taken away from the continent but embraces the continent and the diaspora, the warrior of our survival and the strength that we have. And instead of only feeling pain, I also felt the strength of survival and thrival. And I think it's really important. In healing, we also have to think about how we survive and how we thrive. And the work that I do is towards not only surviving, but to support people to support themselves to thrive, particularly in racialized and indigenized communities.
I think that is just a message that so many people, particularly young people, need to hear. And I actually want to give pause to that statement that you made earlier about, I think probably you, when you reflect on your upbringing, it just was just part of it. But where you say you were chased by dogs, that people burned essentially feces in your front yard in Canada, right? And so, as you said, kind of really demystifying that piece where people think that Canada is just this multicultural place, that it was always full of tolerance, but you experienced really direct displays of racism here. And then kind of your journey and what your mom and family did to make sure that you were grounded in that. And so, how was it for you in school then? Like with your mom, how did she balance that in knowing, okay, racism is out there, but, you sit here as, a PhD, as a professor. How was she able to instill that in you to keep having that resistance and excelling?
I think it's a really great question. I think back to a conversation I had with my mom when I was, mid-teens, maybe 15 or 16, and she talked to me about what she called the lies I had to tell my children. And I said, what do you mean by that? And she said, well, it was such a complex situation. You're experiencing direct impacts of racism and sexism and classism, living in a poor community, being Black and being raised by a soul mother. My parents divorced when I was 3 months. And, the fact that she encouraged us to do everything, that we could do everything. She, told us stories, instilled in us, even though we were experiencing violence, that we could be all that we could be, so to speak. And, by participating in different Black events and different types of activism, et cetera, we really were quite secure, even though we were experiencing violence. And that was the healing process, right? To have that other type of window or that other type of experience where we were valued in the community, where elders, would talk about how beautiful our hair was, braided in beads, twisted, et cetera. And when we spoke or did a spoken word piece, or I was in, African Caribbean play in a funeral scene, I have no idea what I was doing, but I was singing some song when I was 8 years old. So we were involved in the community actively, and that gave us the strength and the beauty, and we were allowed to dream. I believed in all of the kind of things that kids believe in those ages, because I was a dreamer, I was a believer. But also, she says that she had to tell us these things to try to instill us that we could do everything, knowing that there was a lot of anti-Black racism, that there was class, and there's also violence that we were experiencing, and that in this world we would probably be experiencing it, for the rest of our life. So how do you give hope to kids when you know that the system and the context is quite violent? So I think it was a dance that my mom did, and now I understand with kids, I do the same thing. I tell my kids that they can be everything and do everything. However, there's limits, and at certain times I have a boy, I'm gonna have to have a conversation, about particular racial profiling, and girls, because girls are racially profiled. I'm gonna have that conversation, and even thinking about that conversation, it saddens me that I have to do it, but it's also important so that I can protect my kids to be able to deal with what's going to come up based on their Black and African identity. So I think the balance for me was to have that engagement within activism and the engagement within resisting, that when you hear no, you have to say yes. And I tell that to people. I tell that to my students. I tell it to my clients. What did they say to you? No? No. You got to think yes. And it doesn't mean that it's not difficult. It doesn't mean that it's not hard. It is. But we have to encourage ourselves to actually step further than what people will give us, because people are not going to give us much, So we have to go out of that box that they put us in and try to dream and to think bigger and better, and then we can do it. It doesn't mean that we don't have difficulties. I've started in high school. I started the first Black Leadership Awareness Committee, and that was because I wasn't elected in a predominantly Black and racialized school. I wasn't elected for the regular, SAC president. So every college, every university I ever attended, I started a group, a Black leadership, African leadership group. Now I've been doing Black women of African descent, BWAD group for 17 years. It's autonomous. It's, nobody owns it. Anybody who wants to, it's for Black women, but Black men also come support in grad school or how to get into grad school. I've been doing it. There's no cost. People keep on saying, hey, what do I owe you? I say pass it on to the next brother and sister. That's how we're going to do it. If we don't do things for our community, for the village, we can't move forward. And that's something that I've been taught. But it doesn't mean that I don't go through pain, that I don't have experiences of wanting to, leave this country or not feeling strong. I have all of those moments. I have sadness. I have grief. But I am definitely a person who was blessed to understand the importance of African identity, the importance of resistance. And, resistance in psychology, which is another part of, I'm interdisciplinary scholar. In psychology, resistance, particularly from mainstream Eurocentric notions of resistance, are usually the client that doesn't obey, the client that doesn't come, to session or et cetera. It's not compliant. In the way we look at resistance in anti-oppression psychotherapy, which is the model that I co-developed and that we use, is that resistance is a beautiful thing. As African people, as racialized indigenous people, we need resistance. We need to know how to say no. We need to know when a client doesn't come back, there might be a good reason that the client's not coming back. And I as a therapist, or I as a person supporting them to support themselves, need to understand that might be something that helps them to continue on to resist the system, overall structural violence system. So resistance for us is empowering. It's beautiful. It's wonderful. And we need to be able to do that to carry on and to go forward. And my whole life is about resistance. I look at myself as an individual that's connected to a village. And sometimes people are like, what? Like, what? This is this village? We're in Toronto. But if we don't look at ourselves as village and village members, how are we going to support each other, support next person? We have to be able to collaboratively support. And when I talk about anti-colonial perspective, I also want to mention this. I'm not talking about only as an African person who was taken away from the continent or stolen away from the continent. I'm also talking about African sisters and brothers who were left in the continent. And I think that divide and conquer, the dichotomy of African people, African diaspora, particularly needs to be talked about within our community. And there's a transgenerational trauma piece that really needs to be talked about, right? We need to heal those pieces and those divides, which are white supremacist and colonial divide in terms of our communities. So for healing for me is really collaboratively trying to get our communities to have voice and to actually have conversations and hopefully moments that can deal with the transgenerational trauma and real trauma that they experience on a daily basis, being Black and African, not only in Turtle Island and in this country, but in the world globally. And I can tell you many experiences of anti-Black racism that happened all over the world for myself and for African members, and how we have to continue trying to heal. And healing is something that is also not something that can be looked at from a Eurocentric notion for us, because I can leave this meeting right now and I could be followed in Shoppers Drug Mart, or I could leave this meeting and get harassed, in the TTC. So for me, it doesn't matter, what papers we have, what social or class group we might come into. When they see you, they don't say, "Are you from Nigeria? Are you from Trinidad? Are you from Nova Scotia?" They say, "You're Black, and I'm following you." So we need to really understand that as Black people, also in terms of our healing process, and what does that mean when we're constantly. We constantly can experience violence at any moment, and I when I work with clients and I work with community members, we work with that notion and that experience of real violence, and how do you actually try to heal from when you're living in that constant fear of violence or constant actual violence happening to you on a daily basis.
I think based on what you just described about this, like your present work, but also your journey, I imagine it happened as an evolution. I'm not sure. I'm guessing, right? As you learned these different pieces and ways of helping people. So I'm going to kind of take us back a little bit. And so you mentioned like being at, let's say a pharmacy or a shop and being followed, right? Those everyday moments.
Oh, yeah.
And so at least my lived experience, I remember going as a young Black teenager to stores and really being followed quite a bit and not knowing how to maneuver with that, being different than when I'm in a store and I'm followed now.
Right.
Like, as teenagers, we had certain things that we did. So if we went after school, we knew that we would be followed. And so if we're going into a store, we would say, okay, if you had your shopping list or something, take it out of your bag now, because we cannot be fiddling in our school bags in the store, right? Like, actually, unfortunately, as teenagers, we would get mad if somebody delayed us because they happened to fiddle in their school bag for something, and then now security is there and we missed the bus. Like, you can't do that as a young Black kid, was like our are framed. Whereas now, as a Black woman, the way that I would navigate that is slightly different. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you to kind of go back into time. Let's think about when, maybe we'll go beyond high school, but university, your experiences and how you coped and managed with something that a lot of students are still grappling with, which is being the only.
Yep. Well, I think that's an amazing question, and I have to go back there. So it's an interesting thing because I think, I went to McMaster in the 90s and Guelph in the late 90s. And these universities and even the programs that I studied were, at a certain, we knew that after third year, you're going to your fourth year, your honors program, or you're going to master's, that you would be the only one, that there's not a lot of people there. And that experience for me has always, even as a child up to now, being the only one, it's a experience of deep sadness for me. I'm not a person who doesn't want other village members around me. I need Black people around me to survive. It's like I need to breathe. However, we know that as we get more education or we get into particular positions of power, there's less of us, right? So it's been painful in certain ways, but my goal is always to bring more. You know what I'm saying? It's like, bring the village. I'm the person who will bring the village. And doing so, people have different ways doing that. Some people will say, well, to bring the village, I need to not speak and not to show myself until I can get I'm sure that I'm here.
An established
position or tenure or for me right now, it'd be continuing status. And so I will, I'm not going to rock the boat too much. And I understand and I respect that position. However, that's just not me. I am somebody who can be there. The only way I can be there is to be myself. And what I mean is to be vocal, to talk about what I see is missing and to ask questions of why we are not here, and looking at structural violence and systems. If I'm going to, if I'm doing anti-oppression, anti-colonial work, and I can't talk about, intersectional violence, factors such as race, class, gender identity, sexual orientation, age, disability, immigration, all of these factors and how they create violence or stigma in particular communities, in African Black communities, Indigenous communities, then it's a problem with me. Now, doing that, I also become the target of, different problematic and violent behaviors. I know that is that's a choice, and sometimes I think it's a choice or not a choice of mine based on my activists being brought up as a, what I call Blacktivist, actually. I'm writing something on that. We'll see what happens with that. Anyhow, I feel like that is I have to do it. It's my responsibility and accountability as somebody in the community who is grounded in who she is and has always been and has been supported by community members and, as what I say, the village members. I have responsibility to question why there's not a lot of us, or question anti-Black racism or intersectional violence. Now, what I've learned as a person from a child to growing up is that you also have to take a break. So not that I don't question everything, because I kind of do, but I take sometimes I use my silence now to make my point. So sometimes my not opening my mouth, not giving you the information is also a part of my resistance. So I have to choose when I do that and when I don't do that. Living in Hamilton, living in Guelph, myself and the few, African Black identified people were followed a lot in malls. And, I come from Scarborough. Hello. You know what I'm saying? We had a mouth on us. We had a mouth, and we were quite vocal about our experiences of violence and what it was. And, anybody knows that when you say racism, particularly to members of, the I would say white society, they that people freak out, right? People go, they don't like to be told that they're racist. Knowing that it's the Canadian context of racism, this is Indigenous land, racism exists. Unless you're fighting and you're being an active ally, you come from a history and a context of racism as a white person, and you need to do that work. So, we would call people on their racism And we would also have a lot of active, like I was involved in, Black student organizing, and I'm still involved in Black student organizing, even even though I'm not a student. So that was a way to get together and network and to support people. We also had like times where we shared food, because there was, go to Hamilton and Guelph in the 1990s, you're not getting plantain. It's not happening. It's not happening. There's no roti shop, no Caribbean roti shop. You're not getting fufu or kuku, So we'd share our food, and my mom was one of the community members who would bring up, like, she literally would cook pots of food and bring it to share for people, and I would bring it up. And it's interesting, the notions of working class and like not having money, but also like not having money, but being able to share with community through food. So those are lessons that I think I passed on. In terms of being followed, we can be followed in any store. For me, I was quite vocal. I used to turn around to people and say, "Hi, I know you're following me, and I know why you're following me, and I'm following you." And they do a whole kind of thing about it. But what I want to just say about that, when we're thinking about our experiences as kids and as adults, is the amount of anxiety and fear that we have to have, in terms of who's going to follow us and who's not going to follow us, and what does that do in terms of the impact for our mental and physiological health. And that is my concern in terms of the work that I do. It's the anxiety, the act of violence of being, told you're either followed as though you're going to steal something, or actually being accused of stealing something, or, that kind of having that on a daily basis, to be to go in the store and to have to position your bag in a particular way when you're walking. That is violence. And that creates physiological and mental health issues. And I think that's my concern, is how do we support people to be able to deal with it? Because it is an ongoing thing that happens. And it doesn't only happen to old people, young people. It happens to old people. It happens to our youth. It happens to, there's lots of stories of older people who are also followed on the store on a daily basis. So it's another way of being profiled, right? And we can't control it. So
absolutely,
I'm not sure, if I answered fully the question. I probably went all over the place with the question, but I think my experiences as a youth and my experiences as an adult, I know now as an adult that I can take on. It's not only important to take on, but sometimes I need to also remain silent. So one thing I do want to say, because I'm saying two different things. I also, as an adult, support youngsters and anybody else who's being violated based on, anti-Black racism or any type of violence, homophobia, also issues of classism. A Black child comes in the store, doesn't have money, and or doesn't have enough money to buy something, 5 cents, and they're being treated. The store owner is yelling at them, which happened not too long ago. I would give them the money and also tell the person, that this is not okay, and tell the child, you need to boycott the store. What things that I grew up with, but also to also call it out. I'm not a person who's going to be sitting around just to be like, no, nothing happened. Didn't happen to me. I'm happy it happened to that other Black person over. What do we like? We have to, help the village and support the village. So actively caring for each other is critical to healing. Actively being there and talking about these issues. I remember my graduation, my doctoral graduation. I didn't want to go to my graduation because I was done with school at the time. But I went to, Showcase Blackness. I was the only one. And I was standing there and I thought, what? If my experience of, doing my doctoral work as somebody who was legally blind, because I was legally blind when I did it, who comes from a working class background, Black woman, and who's very vocal, people asked me, how did you get through? How do you do resistance education, anti-oppression, anti-colonial methodology, Black woman resistance, and get through? And I said to them, that's the only way I got through, was to authentically be myself and to talk about, and these issues and demand that these issues are important to talk about, that they're not only issues, it's like life and death for our communities, and that we need to actually be able to do work that reflects our communities. And that was very critical for me. If I did something that didn't reflect our communities, I wouldn't have finished any of these, academic endeavors, because these academic endeavors for me were all connected to community, and they have to be to really make to be meaningful and make a difference. I always say my PhD is a community degree, and people are like, what do you mean it's a community degree? The amount of people that have used my PhD, let me tell you, I have to be responsible and accountable for a community who doesn't have access to getting into PhD programs or even when they get into PhD programs or at medical school, but particularly for doctoral people who have doctorates, are not getting jobs. There was a study that came out of New York. 1% of the faculty were of African Black ancestry, and if we do U of T and all these other universities, we'll see also very low numbers of African people. Even in terms of immigration, there's people forget the continent has over 1 billion people and over 170 million people in the diaspora. That's a lot of people. We're not small people. We're many, many different communities, and I think we need to establish the fact that we have scholars, we have doctors, we have critical ways of doing things. We have spirituality, and that's a whole nother story which we can talk about in terms of spirituality, healing, religion, and colonization. That might be another podcast. But to really to succeed for me means to be grounded in your African identity. To succeed to me means to, when you hear no, you say yes. To succeed to me is to help another African Black person when they are down or when they experience violence or when they're needing a hand financially or emotionally. That's a part of the work that we need to do and continue to do it locally and also globally, because we're also obviously connected transnationally, right? We're not only connected to Indigenous Turtle Island land, but Indigenous lands of African peoples all over the place. For me, I also look at myself as a global Indigenous person, and that's also to decolonize our notions of indigeneity and also to bring back the importance of African Indigenous knowledge, which is something that is often not credited.
What you said, particularly with regards to different forms of knowledge, and bringing it back to like healing, and then we're probably going to take it up to even thriving and some self-care in there. And self-care sometimes is not, where I say self-care, it can be part of community care, and that piece that you were talking about, thinking about the community. But where you talk about being able to lend a hand to those who are coming up or other African people, I'm wondering about your practice of anti-oppression psychotherapy. So first of all, what is it? And then is it a practice that is focused only on people of African descent, or what does your practice look like?
Right, excellent, thank you. So anti-oppression psychotherapy, I just want to scream and with like great joy and smile. You can't see my face, but I love this model. I love what it does for people, how it can support people in particular ways. Anti-oppression psychotherapy is a model that came out of my doctoral work, but particularly came out of the work of working in the community for over 30 years, doing healing work in different communities. And it comes from an African Black feminist perspective. And sometimes we think African Black feminist perspective, we forget, or we Eurocentric, we have a Eurocentric notion of African Black feminism that doesn't include Black men. No, sirree. If we look at Black feminist work, we have to include Black men. We have to include our Black families. It's critical to Black feminist work. So I do really want to just mention that, because these days I'm hearing these critiques of Black feminism, and I think that a Black feminist can be a man, and it's about including our men in our struggle as women in terms of anti-Black racism and sexism. So anti-oppression psychotherapy basically is a model of psychotherapy, and it's going to be anti-oppression psychology when my co-director finishes her PhD, which hopefully will be very soon, writing her thesis. It is a model that is decolonizing psychotherapy. And what I mean by that, it's a model that not only addresses trauma and transgenerational trauma from an African Black feminist indigenized perspective, but we also look at factors such as the impact of racism, classism, sexism, homophobia, and intersectional violence on people's lives, how it impacts their mental health particularly, and how and what you can do to support resistance and healing from those types of oppression. I've worked a lot.
Maybe tell us about that piece.
Yes.
How do we do that?
A part of the model is how to support people to support themselves in how they identify. And what I mean by that is that it's so important in a colonial world where people's identity is usually marked by kind of the master's lens, using, a little Audre Lorde, and using tools of psychotherapy, like traditional psychotherapy, which is traditional white supremacist or Eurocentric notions of healing that usually, I'm trained in CBT, I'm trained in emotion-focused therapy, all of these different types of therapy. I'm also expressive art therapist, but a lot of the therapies that are used to support people have a real Eurocentric lens, which means that they weren't made for us. If you look at the history of psychology and even psychiatry, there's scientific racism. There was a real connection to the creation of, and also medicine. The creation of the medical model comes from a Eurocentric notion of healing and being. And what anti-oppression psychotherapy is it turns it around. It looks at the impact of these same systems in terms of causing real trauma and pain to people's lives. Like example, like people who experience racism or experience different types of violence, and how we support them in healing. So one part of the work is to support people in being comfortable to identify themselves in the ways that they want to identify. So being comfortable in your identity, allowing people to voice their experiences of racism or homophobia or sexism is a part of the healing. Because lots of times when people are, go to a psychotherapy or go to a psychologist or a psychotherapist, they actually are they're not allowed to bring their whole experience. So we say holistic, but if you can't bring your experiences of racism or sexism and homophobia and all these other classism and colonization into the room, are you really supporting people when these types of violences are actually creating stress, anxiety, depression, etc.? Diabetes in terms of higher blood pressure, higher sugar levels, etc. All can be impacted by these experiences of racism, etc. I do want to say one thing, that as a person who works in trauma in general, we work with sexual violence, we work with physical violence, financial violence, and we also work with racism as violence, classism as violence, homophobia as violence, et cetera, colonialism as violence, anti-indigeneity as violence. So for us, we've expanded the notion of trauma, and we have created resistance as an empowering piece. So we try to empower our clients to support themselves through different methods. One thing is I also train psychotherapists, lots of psychotherapists, social workers, community members, students, and they always say, what's the tools? What's the tools for anti-oppression psychotherapy? Can you give me a list of the tools? I said the major tool is yourself, number one, your framework, what you think, what do you think about these things? How do you change and unlearn these boxes that you put people in, not only from racialized communities, but also from white communities, from indigenous communities, et cetera, because we also internalize white supremacy. That's a whole nother topic, right? But it's important to look at how we also can deconstruct these notions in ourselves as racialized folks, African folks, indigenous folks, and how do we support ourselves to actually do healing work that will not that we can connect with, that makes sense for us, right? So there's journaling. You can tell a client to journal, but what are they journaling about? How are they learning to deal with the pain of being followed in the store, or the pain of not. Doesn't matter, you do all these degrees, etc. You can't get a rental. You can't get rented a house in Toronto without like 5 references, and some people paying triple and quadruple rent money to rent something in Toronto based on racism, right? What is that? How does that impact you when you're in a job and you lose your job? I work with a lot of people who have lost jobs due to anti-Black racism. One of the most painful things, and you see people who are, our community members who are like really are gifted, Black young and gifted, Black old and gifted, and they have been crushed through the experience of anti-Black violence from losing a job and not having economic stability when they fought so much, working 3-4 jobs to do that, and how do you actually support the person to actually heal from that when they're still going to be dealing with other aspects of anti-Black racism?
And that actually, so that piece is
Right.
the question.
Right.
How do you,
Right.
so we'll, in the show I'll be speaking to many different
Yeah.
people who have different perspectives on how
Right.
you help with that healing or how
Right.
they themselves heal. So I'm going to ask you both of those questions.
Right.
How do you help somebody through that process of healing Because where you mentioned violence, just, to be clear, we're not talking about somebody physically striking someone. We're not necessarily only talking about a one-on-one.
Right.
We're talking about systems so
Right.
that people are living in these systems.
Right.
You as a therapist cannot change those systems themselves.
Right.
So how do you help somebody to heal?
Right. I think that's a good question. I do want to say that I do work with people who have experienced violence from hate crimes, who actually have been physically violated based on anti-Black racism and other forms of violence. So that's
I just meant not limited to that,
yes.
because I think when people think of
Definitely.
violence, it really
Definitely.
is like that one category,
Right.
whereas this is a broad spectrum of violence.
Totally. I think the main thing that we do, or that I do, is to support people to strengthen their identity in terms of having a place to actively listen to their experiences, strategize on how to support them, to support themselves, to do the work. I witness a lot of what people share in the rooms with me or in the groups that I do, but I'm also, and that witnessing supports people to validate their experiences. So number one, I think validating the experience of anti-Black racism, it exists, and that you actually have been impacted. It's an injury. It has done something to you, is critical to the method, because that's not done in mainstream, quote unquote, psychotherapy or psychology. So validating that this happened, this is not okay, supporting people to understand the context in which this has happened, right? So that it's not happening just individually to you, but there's reasons of structural violence that this is happening. And it sounds like, well, how do you connect to people that way? Just having a conversation, saying, I understand that this is happening to you. You are, how do we brainstorm ways to actually support you through? Is it to get, you need rent for next week. You need to be able to be gentle to yourself, because they're thinking of how maybe people will think I'm a failure. The shame that comes up with that. Talking about eating right, during these types of experiences of violence. Building community around them to support them is critical to the piece. I think that different people have different coping strategies. Looking at people's coping strategies and also supporting people to get new coping strategies, to engage in community, to engage in self-care and community care. Because people sometimes talk about self-care a lot without connecting it to a larger community. To me, self-care has to be connected to a larger community. So some people isolate themselves. They experience depression based on different experiences of violence, and supporting them to deal with, giving them different tools to deal with that depression or to engage in community in a healthy way is very important to some of the grief work that happens when experiencing different types of violence, particularly anti-Black racism.
So then I'm now going to ask you,
Right.
So how do you engage in that self-care and community care?
Right.
What brings you joy?
I almost sang, but I'm not doing it right now. The song of joy came into my mind. Joy is so critical to the healing process. We also, within not only within psychotherapy, but my own life. I mean, I've done a lot of theater. And comedy is I write comedy. I know it's hard to believe. I write comedy. I also write drama. But we need to laugh. We need to heal. We need to eat. We need to, I sometimes carnival. I put some music on. I put my soca. I put my African beat on, and I dance. You need to let it go. We need to release ourselves in terms of just the buildup of stress that we have. I always have sister groups, where we go out and we just chill. But sometimes going out means going to somebody else's house because we don't want to go to a restaurant and deal with, foolishness right now. So we might have, a day of just chilling. Somebody cooks some food, pot of rice, a pot of chicken, pot of vegetables. You bring it on. Somebody brings a cake or makes a cake. We have to have moments where we can actually literally let down our hair and relax and release in particular ways. I think joy is really important to healing. It's everything. Trauma is my field. I work with people who've experienced war trauma, people who've experienced domestic violence, child abuse, all these different things, plus on top of the experiences of intersectional violence with racism, et cetera, sexism, et cetera. If we don't learn how to have joy, how do we actually continue on? So for me, in my own life, I am actively involved with people. When I need people in my community, I call out. And it's difficult because we private people, and so I've had to teach myself to actually call. Have my friends, my certain friends that I call, or my family members, and learn how to be able to share my pain. And also to share with my things that I'm doing well. The community was really supportive with this position in Delaland. People called me. I didn't even tell people, but people found out. And people were calling me, and I was like, And I was, taking it and learning to accept those the joy and the love that people have for us. I think is really important. Also, I like a beach. I like a good beach. I like a good coconut water. I like a good mango. I'm a food girl. I'm a foodie. I love food. It's all good. And sometimes, it's also in terms of spiritual practice, how I bring my spirituality. And I believe in a lot of African spiritualities. I have families from many different religions and places, but for me, I call my ancestors, and I pray a lot, and I meditate. Meditation is also part of African spiritual practice, which you sometimes forget. We have African circles. There's traditional pieces there. So I take my time by sometimes, just having my individual time for myself to be able to relax, to slow down, to be able to cry. To cry. I mean, we have to be able to cry. We know there's so many places where it's unsafe for us to cry. Where you're talking about being the only one and not being able to cry when you're experiencing so much anti-Black racism or so much violence or so much foolishness sometimes. And being able to cry, we need to release that. If we don't cry, what happens? Well, again, the tension happens, anxiety happens, depression happens, high blood pressure. There's other things that can happen with not having the ability to shed tears and to try to, the notion of saving face, which means that, we don't cry in our community. We cry a lot. In terms of our clientele, in terms of the practice, we have mainly racialized African folks, indigenous folks, and other racialized groups. We do have white folks too in our practice, and they know that they're working from an anti-oppression psychotherapy practice, so they're aware when they come in that they've chose to do that. I also clinically supervise psychotherapists and practitioners, and I can tell you that everybody that I've worked with, which is a lot of people, we trained people in anti-oppression psychotherapy, the introduction part of it, for over 400 people, and everybody who has who's doing psychotherapy, anti-oppression psychotherapy that I work with, their practices are booming. And it's kind of good and bad, right? It's good because it's something that, we know that works, and people are coming to learn and want to learn how to unlearn problematic colonial ways. But it's sad that the need is so there. So, there's waiting lists in my own practice and other practitioners. We need more people to be able to do this work. In terms of, I just want to talk about legacy, because people sometimes talk about what's your legacy, what you want to leave. I want to be a part of a legacy. I don't want to be a legacy. I want to be a part of a legacy that supports African resistance and African healing globally. That's what I want to be a part of. So for me, I'm not going to be here forever. I want to be here for a long time, long time. But I'm not going to be here forever. So how can I support other people to do, not only do anti-oppression psychotherapy, but do anti-colonial, anti-oppression, resisting anti-Black racism, resisting intersectional violence work? The healing profession is supposed to support people healing, and we know that the medical field and all its ways, the mental health field, are not doing that for our communities. So how do we actually work together to do this? And that's why I'm so excited and happy to be on this podcast. Like, you might have to stop me, because I really believe in this work. It's about healing. It's about dealing with the impact of anti-Black racism, intersectional violence, anti-indigeneity, and it's about happiness and joy. How do we also create joy and healing in a place where we experience pain on a daily basis? Well, guess what? We got to do it. You got to work hard for it. Some days are hard, but you have to work hard to love yourself, care about your community. As I said, sometimes you need a beach if you can do it. Sometimes you can't have a beach, you get a hot bath. Sometimes you can't have a hot bath, you have a hot shower. If you don't have hot water, get a hot tea, get a hot chocolate milk. You know what I'm saying?
Hot.
You have to, something to worry about. I love the things that soothe you, things that make you happy. What is that? And try to figure out how you can engage. And also, I think to look and see who can support you. I'm not into saving people. I'm still trying to save myself. Like, that's difficult. No, I'm here to support people to support themselves. And I think if we practice like that, and practice that people are really the experts of their lives, and that everybody, including myself, including you, Dr. O, needs support at some time. If we really look at that village notion of sharing and supporting, not that the village didn't have conflict, it did have conflict, but looking at how we can actually go through conflict and support each other. I think as African Black people, as Indigenous people globally, will be further off, and we hopefully will have a little bit more hope and a little bit more joy in our life. And I have to believe that for the next generations, our children, our children's children, et cetera, et cetera. So that's just, yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to go to that point where you talked about like connecting with your sister girls, right? And I have had different situations with my sister girls. Sometimes we've connected and talked about our experiences and left the room feeling really refilled and feeling validated and giving each other strength. And then sometimes we have met and then in sharing our experiences just like opened up wounds and then left being like, wait, what do I do with this now? So do you have, advice for those who are meeting together with either their sister girls or their brother boys or their whomever group of support, however they self-identify?
Yes, definitely. I think there's two types of meetings. There's one meetings that, your sister girls or your brothers and your or couples or however you might meet to support each other, and you might be kind of more informal. And then there's the kind of more formal meetings that are, people try to set in the community, more of a community setting, maybe a community center to maybe, try to support people that are dealing with perhaps difficulty in maybe experiencing anti-Black racism in the educational system or some type of topic area. And you still, you might go there and, you're organizing something to support people, and then there's other issues that come up for people. And I think so it's really important to look at the setting that you're actually engaging in community, right? Community means many things. There's many different aspects of community. And for myself, I also consult with organizations, and I also consult with community members. I just had a consult last week with an organization that's trying to do some support for sole parent moms and their children, and trying to do parenting groups, et cetera. And some of the difficulties are, that people are coming to create community and larger projects, but are also coming with their own experiences of trauma and pain and et cetera. So I think it's really important to know your experience, like what you can do and what you can't do. People constantly, my friends are, my sister friends. I love African and African Caribbean people. Oh my gosh, they ask me, I need to see you in therapy. I need to talk to you about this. I need to do. I'm like, listen, this is not my role. So I'm very clear about my boundaries and what my role is, depending on what type of community I'm actually engaging in. So when I'm engaging in community, like, hey, what's up, community, to kind of get my, get grounded or being in kind of a sisterhood. Mm-hmm. I'm very clear that when I'm doing that, I'm a sister in the group, and I'm not your psychotherapist. But that if we're doing something in terms of like my Black women group, we talked about transgenerational trauma. We had somebody who was not who was not sharing their own issues, like it wasn't but was a part of the group on hand to support people if people needed support. Resources I always have a resource sheet with information where people can get support. The reality is that in our community, there's not that much, the support is limited. So I think you have to be very mindful in terms of when you're trying to create community, what you're trying to create, who is it for, what are the boundaries, what are the limits, what are the things that you can do that can support people, what are the things that can actually support people to get together, or to do healing work, what's not possible at the time. And it's very difficult to do that. One thing that I can say for somebody who's, engaged in community for a long time, I had to stop my 4 o'clock morning, 4 a.m. conversations, like giving people my phone number, people calling me at 4 a.m. It's not that I never do that, but I have limits now to where I do the work and how I do the work, based on not only my own notion of burnout, but also liability, right? So I try to resource people a lot. I try to find the resources in the community, the limited ones that we have, and try to give people access to those. So I think building community and creating community is a really important thing. But we also have to there's a lot of steps that we have to do in our community to make sure that it's safe, even within our community, that we have a lot of different locations of what African Blackness means and how is it safe. I want to say, for one example, for the BWAD group, every group when I do a gathering, had a transgenerational trauma gathering, and I make sure that anybody who comes to the group and was invited to the community open to anybody, and many people came to the event. And when we spoke about it, the first thing I did is also introduce that people are coming from different locations, so that people are coming from different classes, social economic status, people coming from different sexual orientations, gender identities, people are coming from different continents, different parts of the diaspora, and that we're going to have to try to create a respectful way of engaging. And for some people, that's cool. For some people, that's not cool. And you, as an organizer, you need to be strong on that, because you need to, if we're creating places and spaces where people are being harmed or being triggered, well, triggering happens, but places where people can't, they actually are worse off coming, then we're not doing our job. But I also want to say, sometimes you can't control that. You organize something, like, you organize transgenerational trauma. That was an event that was very triggering for people. And what we did is we, in the checkout or the closing for everybody, we did a checkout. First of all, we did a checkout, and we did a closing where people could actually voice what their experiences were and what the next steps they were going to do in terms of their own healing. And that was, even though it wasn't a healing group, it wasn't a therapeutic group, it was a community group talking about transgenerational trauma. It was a way to actually have people to experience resource sharing, and also to check in to see if somebody else was, and because my responsibility, I still have responsibility to check to see where people were at, and to make sure that people had other resources or other community members. I love mentoring. I think mentoring, that's what we need to do as a community. I believe Black leadership is not to be the Black leader, but to support people in finding their leader within themselves. So creating community is critical. But what are we talking about how do we define community? What is community? Are we talking about resisting anti-Black racism? Are we also talking about then resisting homophobia, classism, sexism, all of these pieces? As a person who comes from a working class background, it's really critical when I'm working in African Black community, and we address the issues of class and the issues of homophobia and other issues of sexism within the community. Those are critical issues that we need to talk about, because we can't form community if we have violence amongst our own selves.
And actually, I'm going to circle back to the statement you just made about at the end, that check-in and people saying their next steps for healing.
Right.
And so is that a useful tool where people are meeting informally? Because what often happens is the sister, girl, or brother, or, like I said, however people self-identify, informal discussions, which can go in different ways. People could be triggered, not triggered. But overall, there's evidence that it can be therapeutic. It's that validation 100%. Piece that happens.
Right.
So is that a nugget that people can use in their own, families or circles, just kind of at the end, maybe after venting or sharing, it's like, okay, well, what are you going to do as your next step to heal? Is that something you think people should practice?
I totally do. And I think it's not always comfortable for people because they haven't done it, but do it. Like, if somebody just had a conversation and it seemed heavy, it seemed really challenging for yourself or for the person, check in with them. Ask them what are you going to do when you leave here? That's, it's a question that we ask in therapy, but it's a question that I ask my friends. I ask my girls, like, you just cried, you just had a real bad situation, happening at school, work, in life, and now you're leaving me. So what are we going to do? And when am I going to talk to you again? And what do you need? What do you need for me to support? And sometimes people don't know what they need, but they say that they don't know. But if you talk to them, they have like a whole list. It's like, where did you come up with that list? More than I could actually tell them, because your own situation, what helped before. So I think having those conversations, we have to be comfortable with our emotions and okay with being uncomfortable with our emotions. Like, you know what I mean? So even when people cry, and people are, sometimes they're very, very, it's very hard for people to sometimes deal with people who are crying. For me, I say bring it on, like emotionality, like hello, like all the things that, we deal with on a daily basis. We're human. We deserve to cry. We deserve to have emotions. And again, if anybody is, crying and they think that it's too much, because there's the notion a lot I hear, particularly in the Black community, I'm crying too much, people are going to think this and this, and I need to be, I need to be okay, etc. Well, you actually, if your body and your system is saying to cry, you probably need to do that. So for me, I ask people, do you want me to be with you? Do you want me to hold you? Do you want me to give you a hug? How do you want me to support you? And I'm constantly following up on people. We have to follow up on our community members. We have to follow up on each other, And there's going to be days where I'm going to need people. I'm going to need to cry, Dr. O, are you going to be there for me? You know what I'm saying? I'm going to need to be able to, I'm going to need the support from you, and you're going to need support from me. And how do we actually engage in that? Being triggered, being an African Black person living in a colonial world, we get triggered every day. we experience trauma on a daily basis. So our healing is something that we're trying to do step by step, but there's so many things that continuously harm us. So we have to continuously try to support each other in learning of how do we actually we release the pain, release the stress from our bodies, our minds, our soul, our spirits, and carry forward together. That's the only way we can do this.
Yes. How do we support ourselves and support others to support themselves? So we will have many, many conversations, but I thank you so much for being on Race, Health, and Happiness.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
The Race, Health, and Happiness podcast was created by Dr. Onye Norum, and she's our host. The show is produced, written, and edited by yours truly, Dr. Carl Cabasel. Our technical producer is Obadiah George. Associate producer is Shamipe Oni. Original music and our theme song composed and performed by Gold Keys. If you're looking for a little slice of audio happiness, you can check out his music on Spotify and YouTube, or get the links in our show notes. That's Gold Keys, all one word, ending with a Z. Do you have questions, feedback, ideas to share? We would love to hear from you. You can connect with us on Instagram and Twitter at RaceHealth&Happy, and check out the show notes for links to the research that was referenced in this episode, as well as other bonus material. Our website is RaceHealth&Happiness.com. And thank you for listening to Race, Health, and Happiness. Please subscribe to us anywhere you get your favorite podcasts. I'm Dr. Carl Cabasel, and we'll talk with you soon.